Okay, so today is the 11th of January, 2014, and you are?
Walter Pickwick.
Okay, and we understand that you lived during the Sputnik incident in 1957. We'd like to ask you, if it's okay, we'd like to ask you a few questions about your experience.
Yes.
Okay, so let's begin with this one. How and when did you hear about Sputnik?
I suppose it was on the television because they had evening news, but you certainly would know about it in the newspapers. It was all over in huge 4-inch block letters when the Russians launched their Sputnik. It was a huge news story, probably the story of the century, really, as far as I'm concerned. It was that big. It was a national shaking to the very foundations.
I see, a national shaking.
So would you say it struck fear in the hearts of the average American?
Absolutely, because we started to question ourselves. We realized they had a huge propaganda ploy in their favor. We were losing the propaganda war. This was communism against the Western world. Communism was very large, very strong, and worldwide. Everybody saw this as part of the Cold War, and they were winning. When they launched that Sputnik, it caught us completely by surprise. Science Digest ran a story a few months earlier about how they were going to launch a weather satellite in 1961. Imagine that. They were going to wait years to launch their first satellite. When the Russians did it, overnight it became our mandatory national goal to launch our own Sputnik.
I see. What the question that Brian brought up leads me to the next two questions, which I think you started to answer a little bit, but I'll ask you them anyway. So you said it was a shaking to the national foundations. How did you react personally?
Well, of course, I was troubled by it because everybody else was. They made it. It was always on the nightly news, always, and it was always presented to us as if they're winning, we're losing, we got to do something. Well, naturally, when you understand an argument that way, you panic. A lot of people panicked. They thought for certain that it would be a matter of time before the Russians would overrun us. That is why they were selling bomb-out shelters in the 1950s.
Oh, yeah, I think you mentioned that once. Is that why? So you said everybody else was worried, but can you talk a little bit more about I think you already might have talked about it, but how did everyone around you react? Like maybe to change the question a little, how did your family react?
Well, they all considered Russians to be superior. It wasn't that we expected Russians to invade any time soon, but we definitely saw that they were stronger. And the advertisements and the commercials on TV played to that fear. No doubt about it.
In what ways did it change American society as a whole?
Well, it made us look at ourselves, especially our high school education. All the magazines, Time, Newsweek, and especially Life and Look, ran stories, front page cover stories about how tremendously great the Russian high schools were compared to the poorer caliber of American high schools. And they did side-by-side comparisons. They'd take a student from Russia and a student from America, and they would run you through their typical high school day. There's no question about it. The Russians, according to the layout and the story, were clearly superior to the United States in their education.
That reminds me. Another one of our questions, which I think is appropriate to bring up now, is since you were on the topic of education, is how did math and science education change after Sputnik? How would you?
Well, definitely they saw a need to get more math and science into the high schools and even earlier in the grade schools because they really felt the Russians were superior to us in math and science. As it played out, though, we caught up to them relatively quickly and passed them.
If the UK or France had launched Sputnik, what would the American reaction have been instead?
Well, I can't speak for everybody, but I suppose we would have been happy for them, but at the same time a little jealous. I definitely think we would have been a little jealous that we would have had to have done the same thing anyhow. It didn't matter. The Russians won. They were looked upon as the enemy because it was a Cold War, and so we panicked, and we had to get our own satellite up. But if France or England had done it, we would have been pleased because they were allies, but at the same time we would have definitely kicked up our efforts to get our missile up there in the air and get something in orbit.
Were you going to say something? Sorry, I feel
No.
like I cut you off. Okay. Did Sputnik lead you to fear the USSR more than it did before?
Yeah, I think it encouraged people to think more in terms of their superiority over us. It was always there. We always felt that they were a threat, but once they launched Sputnik, we saw that they had the capabilities that we didn't have, and that gave them an advantage over us.
So now, if I might ask, did Sputnik and the events that occurred thereafter alter your life in any way personally?
No, I wouldn't say that. There was nothing much you could do. They got a satellite up in space. We didn't. That wasn't going to change. The pressure was on the people in Washington. Our politicians and our military leaders, they were the ones that could address that question better than I. The common American went about his daily life.
What did America thought about the USSR's scientific capabilities before?
I don't think we knew a lot about Russia. For the most part in the 1950s, they lived under Stalin, and no information got out of the Soviet Union under Stalin. We could only imagine what things were like. We knew from our contacts in Eastern Europe that they were behind the Iron Curtain, and we knew how hard life was behind the Iron Curtain. Now, on that, there could be no argument. My grandmother used to send clothes to Poland during the 1950s, and they were constantly contacting us and asking us for help.
I see. You had some questions, Brian?
In what ways did Sputnik affect the political landscape?
Well, I suppose if it was anything, it might have awakened our politicians. I can't really comment on that because as a kid I wasn't really involved or cared anything about politics. I suppose the Democrats and Republicans came together on this and decided that, yeah, we got to do something, we got to catch up. So I suppose the political landscape in that respect showed us that there could be some cooperation between the two major parties.
Okay, so do you have any further comments about Sputnik and maybe the beginning of the space race?
Well, other than the fact that once we got up into space, that we knew there was going to be a space race. Both sides were trying to militarize outer space, which I now think that most people would agree was wrong because space doesn't belong to anybody. It belongs to everybody. But the fact is, back in those days, under the Cold War that we were living under, either you could say it was self-imposed or it's what we wanted. However you want to think about it, all the newspapers, all the television shows, the radio shows were always revolving around this Cold War aspect. And in my mind, more than anything else, that was the one piece of news that in my lifetime made a drastic, dramatic change to Americans. It had everybody talking about it. Yes, the Kennedy assassination was bad, and that was a shock. This was at least the same shock, if not greater, because it affected everybody.
All right. Thank you for your comments.
You're welcome.